But you see, there is much other evidence from the fossil record. Evolutionists believe, in the course of time, that some fish evolved into an amphibian, that we made the transition from water to land. They're not sure why that took place, but they believe that it did take place, and of course it took millions of years of time for that to happen, as the fish gradually evolved and became an amphibian, such as a salamander or a frog or a toad or something like that, a creature that spends much time on the land, much time in the water, and must lay its eggs in the water because those eggs do not have shells, such as in the case of the reptile. Now, of course, if that's really true, then the fins of the fish had to gradually change into feet and legs of the amphibian. Now, there's a characteristic, you see, that would have changed something quite obvious that we could look for. We could imagine what the intermediate forms may have resembled, so we know what to look for. Well, what kind of evidence do we have for such a change? Well, on this slide, we see a reproduction of the fish in the upper portion of the slide that is supposed to be the ancestor of the amphibian. In the lower portion of the slide, we see a reproduction of what is supposed to be the world's oldest known amphibian. Now, why do evolutionists believe that that fish evolved into the amphibian? Well, first of all, you note that there's some bones in the fins that evolutionists believe could have evolved into the feet and legs of the amphibian. You note, of course, that there's several other fins that had bones, but apparently he found some way to get rid of these, allowing the others to evolve into feet and legs. Now, the evolutionists also suggest there's a similarity in the vertebrae, shows some connection, and there's a similarity in the pattern of bones in the skull. Now, these are characteristics which are supposed to indicate that fish was the ancestor of the amphibian. But I want you to know, first of all, the fish was a fish, 100% fish. It had a lovely set of fins designed for balancing, steering, and locomotion in the water. Look at the amphibian. What do you note? He had the basic amphibian limb, feet and legs. There's not a trace of an intermediate form. Furthermore, note the pelvic bone of the fish. Very small, loosely embedded in muscle. There is no connection between the pelvic bone of the fish and the vertebral column. Well, none is needed. The fins do not support the weight of the body. But look at the pelvic bone of the amphibian. It's very large and firmly anchored to the vertebral column. That is the type of anatomy you need for four-legged locomotion. It's a tremendous difference. And not one single intermediate has ever been found showing something partway between the fin and the feet and legs, or showing these other changes. Now, here we see an exhibit from the Chicago Museum of Natural History a number of years ago of the evolution of the fish into the amphibian. And you'll note, in between, there's a remarkable transitional form, part fish and part amphibian. What remarkable evidence for evolution. Isn't that convincing? How could you see an exhibit like this and not believe in evolution? Well, if you look at the fine print under that intermediate form, you'll find that it's labeled inferred intermediate. Well, inferred indeed. It's strictly imaginary. No one has ever been able to find such a transitional form. The great collection of fossils in Chicago could not produce it. No museum in the world could produce it. No scientist could produce it, so they had the artist produce it. But you see, that's not science, that's artistic license. And that, of course, is an admission of failure. They've never found any intermediate form. Now, on this slide, we see a picture of one of the preserved specimens of a remarkable fish called a coelacanth. Now, the coelacanth fish is supposed to be a very, very close cousin, very close kin to the fish that evolved into the amphibians. Now, evolutionists believe for a very long time that the coelacanth fish had become extinct, they say, 70 million years ago. Now, they postulate that this fish evolved 400 million years ago, and then he died out 70 million years ago. Because, they say, in rocks 70 million years or younger. They have never found fossils of that fish. So obviously he died out 70 million years ago. Until 1938, when he's found to be alive and well off the coast of Africa. And since that time, several dozen specimens of this creature has been found. Guess what? He just forgot to evolve. He's just the same old fish he was supposedly 70 million years ago. As a matter of fact, 400 million years ago on the evolutionary time scale. And his anatomy made him totally unsuitable to be the ancestor of the amphibian. Now, we have something very strange here, don't we? This creature, the very close cousin of the fish that supposedly evolved an amphibian, has remained the same old fish for all of these multiplied millions of years. But his close cousin evolved not only the amphibian, but all the way up into people. Something seemed to be very strange here about this theory of evolution. Now, in the past, there existed creatures called marine reptiles. Now, these were reptiles, but they lived in the sea. We don't have them today. At least we don't have one of them in the San Diego Zoo that I know of, or the aquarium, and until we do, I just don't believe they really do exist. But they must have existed because we find their fossils scattered around the world. Here we see a fossil of a plesiosaur, one of these marine reptiles. Notice that it had paddles. Didn't have feet and legs, but it had paddles. Now, if evolution really is true, then we ought to have a series of intermediates showing the feet and legs of the land reptile gradually evolving into paddles as the creature made the transition from land to water. You see, evolutionists believe the fish worked real hard to get out on land, and then these creatures worked real hard to get back into the water. And so we ought to have many, many intermediate forms. Not one has ever been found. Now, evolutionists also believe that some land reptile evolved into land mammals. And then they believe that some hairy, four-legged mammal, as they say, this is what they say, some hairy, four-legged mammal, perhaps in search of food or sanctuary, ventured into the water. And over eons of time, it gradually evolved into whales and dolphins, as the tail changed into flukes, and the hind legs gradually disappeared, and the front legs changed into flippers. And one scientist published an article in Scientific American a number of years ago in which he suggested that the ancestor of the whales may have resembled a pig, a cow, or a buffalo. Well, one of our creation scientists tried to visualize what these intermediates may have looked like. So he sat down with an artist and tried to reconstruct perhaps what the intermediates may have looked like, and he took the suggestion of one of these evolutionists that the ancestor may have resembled a cow. And we see indeed the cow venturing into the water, and her tail changes into flukes, and her hind legs gradually disappeared, and the front legs changed into flippers. And I suppose if we had a failure in that structure underneath the cow, we would just have to call it an udder failure. But fortunately, everything worked out very nicely, and we ended up with a whale. Now, you see, now this is a caricature, of course, of what evolutionists may have believed, but I've challenged evolutionists, if you don't like these suggestions, what are yours? Can you explain how some four-legged mammal may have ventured into the water and stay there for eons of time as these changes gradually occurred, which were necessary, you see, to live in the sea like a whale lives? Well, they've never been able to do that.